This is AM Joy, June 13th, 2020, 7 a.m.
Everyone, and welcome to AM Joy. I'm Ayman Mohideen in for Joy Reid. We are currently awaiting a commencement address from President Donald Trump to this year's graduating senior class at West Point Academy, where graduates have gathered for an in-person ceremony despite mounting concerns surrounding the potential spread of COVID-19. More than 1,000 West Point cadets, I should say, previously dispersed across the country. They have now returned to campus for today's ceremony in upstate New York, though there will be social distancing measures in place. The decision to press forward with an in-person ceremony has been met with widespread criticism. Now, it also comes the same week that the United States hit another grim milestone of more than 2 million confirmed cases of COVID-19, more than 115,000 deaths. That is more than any other country in the world. At least 15 of those graduating West Point seniors, they've already tested positive for COVID-19 upon returning to campus and were reportedly isolated before being allowed to rejoin their classmates. Trump's speech to the military academy, it also coincides with a growing tension between him and the senior military leadership of this country. An unprecedented number of military leaders from the past and the present have broken their silence to speak out against Donald Trump for his mishandling of the nationwide protests and the public outrage ignited by the police killing of George Floyd. Most recently, the Pentagon's top general, Mark Milley, who walked alongside Donald Trump in this infamous photo now, just weeks ago, as protesters were forcibly dispersed for Trump's church photo op. He apologized, saying that his presence created a damaging perception of the military's involvement in domestic politics.
As many of you saw, the result of the photograph of me at Lafayette Square last week, that sparked a national debate about the role of the military in civil society. I should not have been there.
On Thursday, a coalition of more than 500 West Point alumni who collectively served across 10 presidential administrations penned a letter urging this year's graduating class to uphold the Constitution and suggested that current West Point alumni serving in senior level positions within the Trump administration are failing to do so, hinting at the actions of Defense Secretary Mark Esper, who we should note is a West Point graduate himself, who accompanied Donald Trump during his church photo op. Now, the alumni sent a potent message to some military leaders serving in the Trump administration, saying their actions betray public faith and threaten the credibility of an apolitical military. Joining me now is Congressman Ted Lieu of California. Congressman Lieu, it is great to have you. What a week in U.S. military relations, civilian military relations in this country. I think a lot of people who are watching this, and certainly in my lifetime, they're disturbed by what we have seen emerge as the relationship between the commander-in-chief and the armed forces of this country.
Thank you, Ayman, for your question. I previously served on active duty, and one of the reasons we have the greatest military in the world is because before anyone could become a member of the military, we all had to take an oath. And that oath was not to the president or to the national anthem or to a political party. It was to the Constitution of the United States. And I'm pleased to see so many military leaders now honor that oath and push back against a president who was asking the military to take unconstitutional actions and to engage in partisan activity, and that should never happen.
What has been the most troubling concern for you about the relationship over the past 3 years between President Trump and the military? There's so many aspects and there's so many threads as to the relationship. Is it the way he talks about the military? Is it the way he basks in the glory of the military? The way he refers to generals as my generals? Or is it more recently the actual actions that we've seen the military take and now subsequently apologize for?
It is all of the above, and now you're seeing a breaking point where members of senior leadership in the military are recoiling at what Donald Trump is doing to try to pervert the military to his own uses. He views the military as his own private army. That's not what the military is. A military is here to defend the United States of America, and it's not to be used for domestic purposes. And that's why you see a lot of pushback. Americans are not the enemy. We should not be calling in active duty troops to go against American protesters. And you see now the military recoiling at what Donald Trump wants them to do.
Yeah, and to that point, I want to read you just a quick excerpt from a letter that was written by the West Point, or to the West Point class of 2020 from fellow members of the Long Gray Line. It says, sadly, the government has threatened to use the Army in which you serve as a weapon against fellow Americans engaging in these legitimate protests. Worse, military leaders who took the same oath you take today have participated in politically charged events. The principle of civilian control is central to the military profession, but that principle does not imply blind obedience. I want to focus in on that part, which is those that are part of the military or who were part of the military or who were graduates of West Point serving in the administration, most notably right now, somebody like the Defense Secretary, Mark Esper. How would you say he has handled his position since becoming the Secretary of Defense and that relationship with the president?
Secretary Esper has been disappointing. He has not stood up to the president the way that he should. Not only is he the Secretary of Defense, but he previously served in the military. He understands the oath he took. Just a simple example. Congress members Ruben Gallego, Anthony Brown, and I wrote a letter to Secretary Esper asking him to ban public displays of the Confederate flag at the Department of Defense. The Navy has done it. The Marines have done it. We don't know why he hasn't done it yet for the DOD. And that's just one simple example where he's unwilling to go against the President of the United States, even though it's the right thing to do.
Congressman, stay with me 1 second. I want to bring in Colonel Jack Jacobs, Medal of Honor recipient, retired U.S. Army, also MSNBC military analyst. Colonel Jacobs, it is always a pleasure to have you with us, sir. Let me get your thoughts, first of all, on this. And I want to tap into your history here with the relationship between the White House and the military. Have you seen anything like this that we are seeing play out, this kind of tension that has been boiling between the military leadership, both past and present, currently serving and past officials, and a sitting U.S. president? Have you ever seen this kind of tension before?
Well, not like this, but, you know, frequently there is tension between the president on the one hand, National Command Authority, and the military leaders, especially when the military establishment is required to perform, to go overseas, to follow paths which they think, the military thinks, is not strategically conducive to the defense of the republic. Often the White House has dictated in wars that we fought, have dictated things like targets, specific targets, tactics that are to be used, and so on. In the war in Vietnam, in the wars in the Middle East, even in the Second World War, we found that the White House would try to influence the tactics and the strategies that were used overseas in the military's accomplishment of a military mission. So there's invariably going to be a tension.
Right.
But in the past, I have not seen anything quite like this, where the use of the military establishment has been proffered as something that's really important to do by the White House, and it revolves around the use of the military in quelling legitimate protests in the United States on American soil. It's happened before, and not with a good result, by the way, Eamon.
You certainly know the military and the military mindset better than anyone. You know those young cadets and what they've gone through to graduate on this very important day for them and for their families, and certainly for our country. Have you seen a class graduate from West Point that is on the brink of the challenges that they are facing, both externally and now internally, with a president who, by many people's accounts, has politicized the military in this country?
Well, it's as intense as it has ever been. But you got to realize the situation that these kids are in and how they view their situation. They've graduated from university. They've actually taken the oath of office already, so they're out of uniform, being in cadet uniforms. They took it about a week or so ago. They're ready to go out there and take their place among everybody else who's in uniform. That's all they're looking forward to do. If you're at the bottom of the food chain, as all these kids are, you think less about things like grand national strategy, and certainly even less about domestic politics, than you do about taking care of business, doing what you were trained to do, leading your troops and training them to accomplish the missions that they may be required to do. I remember when I was in Vietnam, and there were lots of protests in the United States against the war, really damaging protests. And the Democratic National Convention in Chicago was a shambles. I mean, this was really bad news back in the States. But for those of us at the bottom of the food chain, your only consideration is accomplishing the mission and taking care of each other. And we focused either exclusively or almost exclusively on that. These kids are getting ready to go out there to do that kind of business, to defend us and to train others to defend us. And I think their focus is much less on domestic politics, thank goodness, than it is on their mission.
All right, Colonel Jacobs, stay with me. We have a lot to cover. I want to widen this conversation out a little bit and bring in MSNBC contributor Malcolm Nance, author of The Plot to Betray America, and Jennifer Rubin, opinion writer for The Washington Post. Great to have both of you with us. Malcolm, let me begin with you. As somebody, again, who has served in our armed forces in this country and knows the mindset, I wanted to pick up on this last sentence of this letter that we are reading that says, the principle of civilian control is central to the military profession, but that principle does not imply blind obedience. The reason why I wanted to talk about that is because we are seeing that play out in the context of law enforcement in this country, where too many law enforcement officials sometimes are saying, I was following orders, they didn't stop their superior, they didn't stop their supervisor from doing something they know was wrong. This generation of soldiers that is about to graduate from West Point, they may be challenged in ways that our democracy has not seen before. What would you say to those young graduates today?
Well, I would certainly point back to the leaders in the armed forces who have already established the precedents. I've actually carved those words in stone. I live near West Point, even though I'm Navy, but I do believe in everything that they learn. I've taken that very same oath. My family has taken that oath almost nonstop since 1864. So we believe in the motto that they are imbued with, and that is duty, honor, and country. You know, General Douglas MacArthur actually has his speech, part of his speech, engraved in stone at West Point, which tells you what that means. And it means, as these, I'll paraphrase him, but it means what you will become, what you ought to be, and what you can be if you serve the nation and the Constitution and not yourself. And he calls it the bedrock, the cornerstone of having courage when there's little chance of having courage, having faith when there's little hope of having faith, and having hope where no hope exists. This is where these young men and women have learned the founding principles that this nation is not beholden to the man or the woman in the seat of the President of the United States, but to the nation itself. They need to not only hear this, it needs to be reaffirmed today that they are the line that defends the Constitution. The other problem is the person giving that speech today is a walking paragon of violations of the basic honor code of West Point, which is you will not lie, cheat, steal, or tolerate those who do. So there's going to be a lot of hypocrisy flying around there today. But as far as I'm concerned, so long as they maintain true to the heart of this nation, they'll go forward and be great servants to this country.
Jennifer, do you think when you look back at, notable generals who served in this administration, obviously a civilian, somebody like a Jim Mattis, General Jim Mattis, and General John Kelly, these were individuals who in the beginning of the administration were often touted as the adults in the room. They were celebrated for having that kind of perspective in an administration that included inexperienced people like Jared Kushner, Ivanka Trump, and certainly even the current president. Do you think that their silence for the first 3 years made things worse, even though they are now coming out and speaking out against this president?
Unfortunately, we won't know, because we don't know if their voices would have been heeded and whether they would have had any impact. There are many times when I think their voices would have been helpful, and I was among those who had certainly encouraged General Mattis, for one, to speak out in many instances in which the military was being misused, in which our international relations were really at the breaking point, where the president, for example, solicited a foreign power to try to get information or try to create information that would be harmful to his political opponent. In fact, didn't do that. And I think in some ways that's what makes it all the more powerful now when they did speak up. You think of all the opportunities that all of them had for 3+ years to come clean, to explain to the country how the president was violating the Constitution, how he was harming the military, and they held their tongue until now. And I think it speaks to the power of the moment, what's going on in the country, where they can see that there is a shift in perception by many Americans. They can see that institutions' values are under assault. And I think it is a tribute to the values that Malcolm just spoke to, that you had generals who, although they were perhaps misled initially, they've now come to their senses and they realize what that code really means. How often in one's career do you get to act upon the very generic, basic concepts in which you took your position? Here they have to live that oath, and I think it's a remarkable moment, and kudos to those who have recognized it. I have never seen, maybe Malcolm, who's much more astute in his military history than I, can remember an instance in which the Joint Chiefs, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs came forward and abjectly apologized for his behavior, and moreover went through the history of the military and pledged that the military had to do better on race. It was really an extraordinary moment, almost I think unprecedented in the military, really asserting those civilian values and those constitutional values that so many politicians, unfortunately, have failed to do.
I want everyone to stay with me for a moment. I just want to set the scene for our viewers. They're seeing live pictures there of the 1,100 or so cadets make their way onto the graduating field. We should note, obviously, you can see all of the cadets wearing face masks. We also, if you can, have noticed the chairs relatively apart from one another within social distance guidelines. You can see almost at least 6 feet apart. I want to note a little bit about what the Wall Street Journal described in this moment, which is that Trump is set to speak, obviously, at a socially distant West Point commencement. To manage health concerns, they write, the event has been drastically overhauled. The roughly 1,100 graduates will be seated 6 feet apart, as we can see there on our screen, and won't shake the president's hand when they receive their diplomas. Their families will watch the program moved from a 38,000 seat stadium to a parade field via live video. Congressman Ted Lieu, from your perspective, I know this is such an important day in the life of these cadets and in the life of the families who have sacrificed so much and will continue to sacrifice as these young men and women go into the armed forces. Do you think this was a smart decision by West Point to host this ceremony in the middle of a pandemic to provide the backdrop for the president to come and give this speech?
Well, let me first say that one of the most rewarding jobs of a member of Congress is to nominate amazing students to our nation's service academies. So I honored these cadets today who are graduating and honor them for the upcoming service to our nation. In terms of whether there should have been an in-person graduation at West Point, absolutely not. They had to bring in all of these cadets, over 1,000 of them. 15 of them tested positive for coronavirus. They could have gotten the infections from other people where they were traveling or given to other people where they were traveling. They should have followed what the Navy and Coast Guard did and simply have a virtual graduation with a virtual speaker. Donald Trump could still have given this speech, just done it virtually. There was no reason to have this in-person graduation and put people at unnecessary risk.
Yeah, I was going to say, and I could be wrong, I don't know of any other graduation taking place in this country in person as of yet. Let me just, again, Colonel Jacobs, your thoughts as well, as I kind of just ask everyone on the table here. Do you think this is a ceremony that should have been held in person? Are you concerned that it is being used as a backdrop for a president who wants to make an important message, or deliver his message, rather, against the backdrop of a military setting?
Well, there are three things here. First of all, the Air Force Academy earlier last month had a graduation just like this. It doesn't make it right, but they had a graduation just like this. The second thing is that both the Army and West Point went out of their way to make sure that people did not transmit. They were quarantined. They were checked when they got back to West Point, and then they were quarantined again. They were in relatively small groups, and so on. So they've done the best they possibly could in order to make this situation less difficult than it otherwise would be. But there's something to keep in mind. The The superintendent of the United States Military Academy works directly for the Chief of Staff of the Army. And the Chief of Staff of the Army, through the chain of command, works for the President of the United States. And if the President of the United States decides that this is going to happen, then this is going to happen. And the only way to avoid it, well, there's no way to avoid it. The people in the chain of command below the President can decide that they're not going to follow the order and can resign. That didn't happen in this case because both the Army and the Military Academy figured that it could reduce, through its actions, could reduce the threat. Nevertheless, there's no point in having a situation like this solely for the purpose of giving the President an opportunity to be in front of the cameras. That's something else entirely, and it raises the question of whether or not this is actually just an opportunity, a situation in which the military is there to support a political end of the President.
Jennifer, I got to ask you, how long do you think it'll be? Do you think it will be used in a Trump political campaign commercial?
Well, this is unfortunately what the president does. He uses the military as a prop. He staged, if you recall, that July 4th celebration last year with the jets and the military equipment on the ground, because he thinks of the military, as we've said before, as his generals, his military. I think deep down he must know that he's a coward, that he didn't serve his country when his country called him, and he now makes up for it with this false bravado. I would note one thing that's very interesting. This comes just before the president is about to go back on the road to massive rallies without social distancing, without masks. If West Point can do it, and if West Point insists that it is for the health of our military, why would Trump allow civilians, his supporters even, to put themselves at such risk? It also underscores really the absolute narcissism of this president, that all he cares about is the optics, the picture. He doesn't care who gets sick, who dies. He doesn't even care if, quote, his voters are the ones most affected. He wants his photo ops at the convention, at these rallies, at West Point. And as a result, he puts people in harm. He makes people more likely to become infected and to die. We've never had a president who behaved in such fashion.
And we should note, as we did at the top of the hour, we've hit 2 million cases of COVID patients in this country, 115,000 deaths, and still climbing, and the president about to go back on the campaign trail, I believe next week at the earliest. Malcolm Nance, let me ask you really quickly, the Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Mark Milley coming under a lot of scrutiny, a lot of criticism. NBC reporting that at one point he considered resigning. Do you think he should have resigned?
I don't think he should have resigned. I think what he did was the right thing, was that he maintained the chain of command. He showed everyone down the chain of command what a real leader is like. All right? You know, everybody uses this old phrase, when you mess up, you fess up. Well, what General Milley did was he suddenly realized he was used by Donald Trump. He was used. So did the Secretary of Defense. Realized they were both used that day. I understand his excuse for wearing his battle dress uniform, because he was over at the FBI. Accepted. But being brought out there and then having the National Guard do what they did to the civilians there, having National Guard helicopters, believe me, within that 24 hours, that went into his head. And he started thinking about the code. He started thinking about the traditions. He started thinking about the duty and the honor of his country. And by coming out and making that speech, he has recalibrated the armed forces of the United States. Further to the last question you asked, Colonel Jacobs, I know I'm senior enlisted here for this conversation. When the president issues an order, it comes in two flavors, lawful or unlawful. This is a lawful order to assemble the Corps of Cadets at West Point. I know what's in Donald Trump's head. He used to be at Storm King when he was in high school at the New York Military Academy, New York Military School just down the road, where he dressed in a uniform just like this. That's playing toy soldiers. It may be a lawful order, but there are two types of lawful order, right? Stupid and dangerous. In this case, they are both stupid and dangerous. But the Corps of Cadets and the military chain of command is showing you that they maintain the chain of command. They maintain the dignity of these troops, and they will go forth and be great leaders, having gone through this very challenge But what I'm afraid of is the things that are going to come out of the president's mouth on that stage today. They are going to be absolutely abhorrent. I know it. And these people will still go forth and do their jobs.
And it's certainly nothing to take away from the incredible work they have done to get to this point in their lives and where they go forward. We're going to bring those comments to you live when they do happen. I'm going to ask all of you to stay in place. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll continue to monitor the speech there in West Point, bring those comments from the president and others to you live, and have all of our panel join us once again on the back end of that. Everyone stay with me. We'll take a quick break.